Well, we're here in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and we're with Jim and Maureen Downing, Navigators from the very beginning, and today we're going to conduct an interview just talking to them and asking them a little bit about themselves and about the history of the Navigators. So, Jim, could you tell us a little bit about you and Maureen?
Yes, well, first of all, I'm 94 years old, coming up on 95, and she doesn't disclose her age, but she's younger than I am, I can tell you that. And I met Dawson Trotman for the first time in 1933. I became a Christian in 1935 as a result of his ministry, and was involved with the first half dozen guys that he discipled. And Marina, you were a student at the Bible Institute of Los Angeles at that time, right?
I am,
And your acquaintance with him was that you were recruited by him to teach high school girls Bible clubs, which they call martyrs clubs. Is that right?
That is,
Yeah, what else you want to say? You lived in their home for how long?
A year.
What are your memories of living in the home?
When we lived in 6th Street,
Long Beach, yeah.
Palm Beach, we couldn't go to sleep after everybody left. It's sometimes midnight.
Yeah, it was a little 1,600 square foot home with 2 bedrooms. When Lauren came, he slept in the garage. But the girls that lived with Trotmans had to sleep in the living room on a couch, and they couldn't make up their bed till everybody left for the night.
That's pretty rough, Marina.
Yeah.
That's kind of like living in the barracks or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's great to be with you all this evening. And Jim, tell us about the history of the Navigators.
Yes, well, I know when I'm asked to talk about the history of the Navigators, what they really mean is the ancient history.
That's right.
The early history.
Yeah.
But I like to point out to people involved in the Navigators that the most important history is being written today. And every Navigator group is an important chapter. So it's interesting to talk about ancient history, but the exciting things are what are happening today. So in my mind, I like to ask the question, why is there a Navigator history today? Our Navigator presence in 104 nations today? I believe the answer is that God purposed to revitalize important biblical principles among the nations. And today, the Navigators are operating in 104 nations of the world. I think in understanding the Navigators, I'd like to quote a missionary statesman named D.E. Host. And he said, when God raises up a man for special service, he first works in that man the principles which later on are, through his labor and influence, to be the means of widespread blessing to the church and the world. That's kind of complicated British prose, but that's a quote from D.E. Host that I think if we'd summarize what we're saying. He said, when God gets ready to bless the church and the world through a principle, he first picks out a man to model that principle. So an institution is the lengthened shadow of one man, so said Emerson. The Navigators movement is the lengthened and broadened shadow of Dawson Trotman, the man God chose to model the biblical principles he wanted revitalized among the nations. At age 21, Dawson wrote a letter to the president of the Dallas Theological Seminary. We have a copy of that letter, and I think we need to read it into the record here. You see, it was written at Lomita, California, where he lived, January 16, 1928. He said, Dear Sirs, I'm writing to you for advice on a matter of much importance to me. I graduated from high school in June 1923. Owing to the fact that I had little or no ambition in life, my education was sadly neglected. I've worked these 4.5 years, 2 in selling dry goods and furniture, and the remaining 2.5 years in a lumber yard. I'm now driving a Ross Carrier in a lumber yard, and I'm nearly 22. Now, the Ross Carrier was the forerunner to the forklift, a high-wheel cart that could pick up lumber. And because there's not much room in a lumber yard, it was built so it'd run forward and backwards equally. So in those days when I first met him, there wasn't too much traffic in Los Angeles. And when he's going to leave the house, he'd take a look, and if it was shorter to the corner behind than it was the front, he would back to that corner, because he could drive backward just as well as he could drive forward. So that's what he was doing when this letter was written.
Yeah.
Then he said, about a year and a half ago, I was converted from a wild life, drinking, gambling, thieving, lying, smoking, and so forth, having had a part in my makeup. I'm now saved by grace, and I've had victory in overcoming all these wild habits, perhaps one of the most rotten dispositions, also having been defeated through the power of Christ. I've been the president of one of the liveliest Christian Endeavor societies for a year, and have spent many precious moments in service for him. Now we begin to see what's high in his value system. He said, I have preached 2 sermons and have given many talks, and I'm not afraid to stand out anywhere and preach the gospel. My happiest moments are spent in dealing with men, boys, and girls about Jesus Christ. As a fisherman, Matthew 4:19, I've won 2 souls to Christ. I say this only that you might know the little experience I've had. I love to pray, having had real burdens and delight in reading God's Word. I've memorized 10 chapters of the Bible and can quote about 120 passages, being able to tell you where they are. I memorize while I work. Having set my goal for souls high, I must do big things for the Master. And I look to you as having had practical experience for advice as to preparation, realizing my utter inability to do anything but by and through him. Expository preaching holds much attraction for me. Thank you kindly for your service. Yours respectfully, Dawson Trotman. And he had a P.S. on the letter, said, I'm just beginning a course in better English with the International Correspondence Schools. This letter was directed to the president of the Dallas Theological Seminary. And if they ever answered it, I don't know. But they did send us a copy of it when they found it in their files.
Right.
He had a mentor, a Presbyterian pastor named Vernon Morgan, and he helped him codify these principles that were operating in his life. And Mr. Morgan introduced him to the 3-legged stool illustration, where that a stool would turn over if you don't balance equally on all 3 legs. And these were the Word, prayer, and witnessing. But Dawson didn't like that illustration too much for 2 reasons. One, he didn't like the idea of the Christian sitting down. And the other, he knew people that memorized, studied the Word, had a good prayer life, and witnessed, but they had such an unpleasant disposition. They turned other people off. So he came up with a more dynamic illustration, a wheel. And he had a 4-spoke in here on the right, based on Colossians 3:23. Whatsoever you do, do it heartily, as unto the Lord, and not unto men. And in his first wheel, the hub was Christ. Everything else that went had to be the outgrowth of a Christ-centered life. Today we use a different version of the wheel. But there's some words I'd like to sprinkle through here, not line them up. But first there was a man. Then there was a method or tools. Then there was a promise. Actually, this is the promise, Isaiah 58:12. And they that shall be of thee shall build up old waste places. Thou shalt raise up the foundations of many generations. And that's King James. The later versions kind of take away the important things. Now, the first time I heard him give this verse, we were going to spend the day together. He picked me up at the Navy landing, and instead of going to his home, he pulled out in the parking place on the parking lot. So I got something I got to show you. So he opened up the Bible, this verse, and showed it to me. And he said, you know, I'm scared to death, but I know that God said he's going to do this through me. And so most of you folks who are watching this are the result of the foundations that he laid and are laying new foundations. But before the Navigators came, Trotman headed up 2 different teams, the Fishermen's Club and the Minutemen. Now here's an entry from his journal, August 28, 1932. Here were the 9 duties that the members of this Minuteman had to do. 9 duties were listed in the following order: memorize a verse a day, have an hour a day with the Lord, touch a life a day, have a definite work to do each week, keep a journal, have ammunition ready, by that he meant a tract or a Gospel of John, have team business up to date, read 2 hours a week, that was for personal development, tackle own task. And then each was to have to keep a daily checkup list and report the results at the weekly business meeting. 2 weeks later, they met and apparently thought that this was too heavy duty. So instead of cutting it down, they added 3 more, which are memorize a half a hymn a week, review 7 verses a day, spend some definite time on our filing system.
Wow.
Now, there's a phrase that was coined by Dr. Munger, who gave the dedication of Glen Erie. He said, discipline without desire is drudgery. And none of the people on the team shared the same dynamic values as Dawson did. So he picked out the one who was the most spiritual, Walt Sutton, and said, would you pray for me? And Walt said that he would. And he said, well, I'll pick you up on my motorcycle at 3:30 in the morning. And Walt thought he said 3:30 in the morning. And sure enough, he said 3:30 in the morning. So picked him up on this motorcycle. They went down and started off praying for the people they knew put on the team. But the burden didn't lift. So after now, if you've been in a 2-hour prayer meeting every morning, you know you can cover a lot of ground. So they prayed this team guys into the ground, but the burden still didn't lift. And they said, well, we know other people like these. And after they'd exhausted their efforts with them, they said, well, I bet there are people in neighboring cities like these that we don't know their names. And they said, there's probably people in Oregon and Seattle, like in California. Then they moved west. So pretty soon they had prayed for young men to get out into business in all the 48 states then. But the burden still didn't lift. So the last week of the 42-day prayer meeting, they took a map of the world and put their finger on various countries and cities, asking God to raise up what he called down-to-business Christians in that place. I asked him one day, I wasn't around at that time, do you remember what countries and cities you put your finger on? He said, well, I remember some of them, but not all of them. But today, when we look at the map of where the Navigators have a presence, I think we can pretty well recreate that prayer list.
Jim,
So,
that was a really important time. Do you feel like we should be continuing that, not as a tradition, but as a spiritual discipline, praying through the map, the world?
I think maybe it isn't everybody's call to do it,
Okay.
but somebody needs to be doing it.
Okay.
And I think we can see his influence. Now, the burden just wouldn't lift until they had prayed that through. But yeah, I think some need to be this. GE Host, who I quoted at the beginning, used to call the missionaries in, and he would walk around the room and pray for 2 or 3 hours. So one day he had a missionary in, and he said, now you pray after 2 or 3 hours. And the missionary said, me pray? What would I pray for? You've prayed for everything you think of. And Host said, I left you a whole continent.
Right.
So somebody needs to be praying.
Yeah.
Well, during this period after the prayer meeting, he attended Bible seminary for a year and the Bible Institute for a year. While he was in Biola, he had a classmate named Helen Rittenhouse. Now that's very important in the history of the Navigators. She lived in San Diego. She and her mother used to invite people home from church to dinner and a Bible study. One of the guys that they thought came out to study, she said, now this guy shows real promise. He had joined the Navy to save money to go to college and seminary and become a pastor. In those days, there was no GI Bill or college loan program, so if you had the money, why, you could go. If you didn't, you couldn't. So a lot of people joined the Navy just to save money to go on to college. So he was one of them. Well, she saw he had such zeal that she thought maybe Trotman could help him. So she wrote Dawson Trotman, told him about him, told Lester Spencer, now look him up. When he comes up there to Long Beach, go aboard ship. Well, guess who looked up who? Or whom? It wasn't Spencer looking Trotman up.
Hmm.
Now, his story is on the Navigator website, discipleship.com.
Mm-hmm.
There's a few tapes on there that have my name on them, and one of them is West Virginia Gang.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got his account of his meeting with Dawson Trotman, which is very interesting. What happened was that Lester Spencer is in a picture I've got here over to the left.
Mm-hmm.
That they were sitting up overlooking the harbor in a place they didn't realize it was Lover's Lane, but it was. So while they were talking and having fellowship, a watchman from the school that was a off-duty policeman probably came over. Well, this was during the days of Prohibition, so whenever you saw two guys sitting out in the dark, you knew they had some illegal whiskey. So the watchman came up and said, "Okay, guys, where's the bottle?" Now, it wasn't that he was trying to enforce the law as much as he wanted to sample, probably. That was pretty common those days. I read in the paper once somebody wrote up about this gangster that had been killed and said he left a wife and 7 policemen to support. So not all of them were looking to enforce the law.
Yeah.
So Dawson began to talk to him. He said, "We don't have a Bible, we've got a Bible." And he said, "If you don't believe it, you've got a key to the schoolhouse you're guarding. Go in there and turn on the lights and I'll show you." So they did. And he began to talk to him about the plan of salvation, about Christ. He didn't make a decision. But here this eager young sailor was sitting there, and he was amazed he could turn right to the very passage. No matter what the man brought up, he had an answer. Well, after they were through then, he turned to Dawson Trotman and said, "I'd give my right arm if I could do what I've just seen you do." Mm-hmm. And Dawson, "Oh, no, you wouldn't. I've had a lot of guys say that. No, you wouldn't." And he said, Lester said, "I said I would." "No, you wouldn't." And then Lester kind of come alive and said, "I said I would." And Dawson said, "Okay, I'll teach you." Mm-hmm. So that was the beginning, that contact, the Navigators, this guy. Now, he came aboard ship a few months after I did. By the way, Dawson Trotman, then soon Lester contacted some other people, and instead of having Glen Erie or a nice home, they met in a trailer behind a gas station. Mm-hmm. Where Dawson Trotman worked 6 hours a day, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, pumping gas. That was a Texaco gas station. Just jumping ahead a little bit, the guys had Wednesday and Saturdays off, Wednesday afternoon and all day Saturday. They'd come over. He couldn't talk to them because he's pumping gas. So they said, "There's something wrong with the picture. You've got what we want. You're not available." "Why?" He said, "Well, my wife and I have developed a very bad habit. We eat 3 times a day. And I work for Texaco to support the habit." Well, these guys are pretty sharp, and they said, "Well, between us, if we would give you the same amount of money that Texaco gives us, would you give us your time instead of Texaco?" And they made a deal. So that's where he became full-time in working with men, and never did hold a full-time job after that, as far as I know. So God had the man. He had perfected the tools. He had a promise. They had a prayer meeting. Now he needed a laboratory. So God picked out the perfect laboratory, and that was the ships, particularly large ships in the U.S. Navy. It was a perfect laboratory because there's plenty of time. We didn't have any radio, television, VCR, radar, newspaper. When we went out to sea, it was like a black hole. So we had many hours of leisure, 1,500 men on the ship, perfect place to grow and to evangelize and to disciple people. So the West Virginia, the ship where it all got started, became known as the floating seminary. Now, I came aboard ship a few months early in Leicester and had a minor supervisory role over him. By the way, when I went in the Navy, I thought there's probably some way to get ahead. I soon found out if I would show up for work 5 minutes before everybody else and stay 5 minutes after everybody else left, I'd soon be in charge. So that's exactly what happened. So there were 75 people that I saw 3 times a day. Lester was one of them. One day he showed up with a black eye. And I said, if you'd stay on the bar, you wouldn't get beat up. Well, Dawson Trotman just teaching him to witness, and he said, I didn't get that in the bar. I got it playing football. He said, I'm a Christian. Well, that kind of shook me up. I thought everybody who went to church was a Christian, and anybody that was excited about it was a fanatic. But he, first of all, gave me that testimony. A few days later, my mother gave me a Bible, my first Christmas, as a good luck charm. Nobody told me what to do with it. I found there's good use for it, that if I had any extra money, I'd slip it in the pages of the Bible, figured nobody'd look in there for it. So one day somebody wanted to borrow a couple dollars. He came by, I took it out of the Bible. Lester saw me. And he said, the Bible's good for something else besides keeping your money in. And that time on, he was on me. And eventually got me over to meet Dawson Trotman. And to Dawson Trotman, there were only two kinds of Christians. The ones who were down to business and the ones that weren't. And on the ship, in all that isolation and opportunity, on Monday, from 7:30 to 10 every evening, we had fellowship and studied a new chapter of the Bible. Mm-hmm. Tuesday, we had an evangelistic study for all the ship. Wednesday, we had an extended prayer meeting. Thursday, we had fellowship and studied an Old Testament chapter. Friday, we took a Old Testament chapter. And on the weekend, if it were to see, we had a mini conference. Well, we were learning what to do from Dawson Trotman, and as a teacher, that's what he looked like. My outstanding impression of him was from the Friday and Saturday night meetings. And the meeting would last from 1 3/4 to 2 hours every Friday and Saturday. I had special privileges, so I was in the meeting both Friday and Saturday. So one day he said to me, I really appreciate, you sitting through those long meetings, knowing there's a lot of repetition. And I said, well, I generally have somebody with me that's profiting. But I do have a thought. I think if you'd spend a little more time in preparation, it wouldn't take so long to give your message. Well, he immediately said, I see you don't understand. And I said, apparently I don't. What is it I don't understand? And then he said, I'm determined that no person in that room will ever be the same after the meeting. That sharpened up my powers of observation, and I watched him. He'd take a subject like scripture memory and talk about it. He could tell he had good rapport with the audience. He could tell wherever everybody stood on scripture memory. When someone would look him in the eye, give him a high sign. Others would look at the floor. Some of them wouldn't even look up. So he'd start hammering away until he saw several people look up. Now, okay, you persuaded me. I'll start memorizing. And he'd take another subject like Bible study or prayer. He did that until he had uncovered a need in the life of every person in that room and preached until he saw some kind of response. That's what he meant. It takes a little time. He didn't have that intensity all of his life, but that was Dawson Trotman, the basics, the things that are in the wheel. And it was instilled in all the other people that were around him. That comes under the heading of tools. On the West Virginia, we had a different team about every year. There is our picture of our 1937 team. And all these guys are in heaven today, so I look forward to a reunion. But I've got this picture for the man in front on the left named John Prince. He was a fearless witness. And he moved from the West Virginia to another battleship, the Idaho. When we felt a person was mature enough to leave, we set him on another ship to start a ministry. Well, the day he got over there, a former shipmate on the West Virginia that he'd witnessed to threatened him, if you witness on this ship, talk about Jesus Christ. I don't know what he threatened him with. But John Prince told me, he said, I hesitate to think of my response. I said, Lord, I pray you either convert him or that you'll remove him. So that night, this sailor, name was Abel, went ashore. And he was found dead on the Long Beach Pike. Cecil Davidson was not a Christian at the time, but he was on the same ship. He's on our staff today. he was on once when the message came in. He tore it out of his diary and gave it to me, and that's his diary. And he said, A.W. Abel, Seaman's second, died of unknown causes on the Long Beach hike. So his death certificate showed that it was unknown causes. Mm. He went on to have a fabulous ministry. Now, we didn't have a lot of things like that happen, but I think we got a little arrogant. We felt the fleet probably existed for our convenience to spread the gospel. If we didn't like the captain, we'd pray him off. If we didn't like the chaplain, we'd pray him off. If we didn't like the ship's schedule, we'd pray change, and it would change. Mm. So we had a great time during that time. The West Virginia, there were some pictures of it earlier. But that's what I looked at. On that morning of December 7th, 41, mm-hmm. we caught 9 torpedoes and 2 2,000-pound bombs. Mm. The 2 bombs didn't explode, but the 9 torpedoes were all that was needed to put her on the bottom. Mm. Actually, Pearl Harbor, not everybody knows, is a shallow harbor, 40 feet. And a battleship draws 34 to 36 feet, depending on the load. So when the ship sunk, all except one of them, or 2 of them, rather, just sit down in the mud. Mm. So that's what she looked like at the height of the attack. Everything above the waterline was on fire. Mm. Well, I've got a table of statistics here. Mm. Kind of hard to understand. I've heard there's 3 kinds of lies: white lies, black lies, and statistics. But this shows that between 1950 and 1989, 39 years, the population of the world doubled from 2.5 billion to 5.1. The number of people who call themselves Christians also doubled from 854 million to 1,722,000,000. But there's another category that the missiologists call Great Commission Christians. They're the people that know about the Great Commission and feel an obligation to do something about it. The number increased from 80 million to 500 million, 600%. Wow. And the Navigators were at the forward thrust of that movement. Mm-hmm. The number of laborers on the field increased to 25,000 mm-hmm. after World War II. Now, the Navigators didn't touch all those, but the majority of them came out of Navigator ministry. So these guys got out, went to seminary, went on the mission field. In fact, Dawson Trotman, for many years, did not see the Navy or the military as a place of ministry. It was a place to recruit. Get overseas, get overseas. That was his message. Right. Well, through this presentation, the words are the man, and then methods, tools. There was a promise. There was a prayer meeting, and the tools led to maturity. His favorite verse was Colossians 1:32, and that was that the mission is to present every person perfect in Christ, mature in Christ. Maturity leads to reproduction. Reproduction leads to the Great Commission. So the Navigators are part of a chain, that you've got a method, you've got a promise, you've got tools, they lead to maturity, maturity leads to reproduction, reproduction leads to the Great Commission. So Dawson Trotman was driven by the Great Commission, and he gradually saw the things unfold that he didn't know one at a time what was happening, but he was providing people for the Great Commission, which was his drive in the first place. When I became a Christian, I didn't know what the Great Commission was, and so he explained it to me. And what he said was, if it were possible for you to exchange your salvation for $1 million, would you do it? And of course I said, no way. And he said, you feel very strongly about it? And I said, yeah. He says, God is no respecter of persons. He wants everybody in the world to feel the same way you do about Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. So that was a great commission to him, that everybody has a right to know what we know after our relationship with him. Mm-hmm. So if I was going to summarize, I think I would do it by just, again, say that the 4 important things, I think, in this presentation are tools, maturity, reproduction, Great Commission.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Marina. We really appreciate you holding Jim up all these years and being with him and through all the years. And it's been good, and we really appreciate the investments that you've made for 75 years now. Obviously, Dawson Trotman's vision, you carried that through in your own practical living for Christ, and the kingdom has been tremendously impacted by you and Marina as well. So we really appreciate you.
Well, we were maybe a foundation of one generation, but the promise has been fulfilled that Dawson raised up the foundation of many generations.
Yeah, it truly has. Well, thank you.